In the cramped tenements of Brooklyn's Navy Yard district, where the acrid smell of the East River mixed with the cacophony of a dozen different languages echoing through narrow corridors, a legend was born on January 17, 1899. Alphonse Gabriel Capone entered a world where survival demanded cunning, where respect was earned through strength, and where the American dream seemed as distant as the sun-baked hills of the Italian villages his parents had reluctantly abandoned. The great wave of Italian immigration that swept across America in the final decades of the 19th century brought with it millions of souls seeking escape from poverty, political instability, and the rigid class structures of the old world. Among these hopeful masses stood Gabriele Capone, a man whose weathered hands told the story of countless hours wielding a barber's razor in the small town of Castellammare di Stabia, near Naples. He had arrived in America in 1893, carrying little more than hope and the tools of his trade, driven by stories of prosperity that drifted back across the Atlantic like whispered promises. His wife, Teresa Raiola, followed with dreams of prosperity that seemed to shimmer just beyond reach in the bustling, unforgiving streets of New York. She was a woman of quiet strength, shaped by the hardships of rural Italian life, yet possessed of an unwavering determination to see her family rise above the circumstances of their birth. Together, they settled among thousands of other Italian immigrants in a neighborhood where old-world traditions collided daily with new-world realities, creating a unique cultural landscape that would profoundly influence their children's development. The Capone family eventually grew to include 9 children, each born into a world that demanded adaptation and resilience. There was Vincenzo, who would later change his name to James and pursue a career in law enforcement, creating one of history's most ironic family dynamics. Ralph would follow his younger brother into the criminal underworld, while sisters Rose, Mafalda, and others would strive to maintain respectability despite the notoriety that would eventually engulf their family name. But it was their 4th son, Alphonse, who would forever alter the family's destiny and etch the Capone name into American folklore. The Brooklyn of young Al Capone's childhood was a universe unto itself, a place where legitimate opportunity was scarce and alternative paths to success beckoned from every street corner. The neighborhood teemed with energy and desperation in equal measure, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously vibrant and dangerous. Pushcart vendors called out in broken English, hawking everything from fresh produce to second-hand clothes, while children played stickball in narrow alleys that doubled as makeshift marketplaces and informal meeting grounds for the area's various ethnic communities. The tenement buildings that housed the Capone family and their neighbors were marvels of efficient misery, designed to pack as many families as possible into the smallest conceivable space. 5-story walk-ups contained dozens of families, each occupying 2 or 3 rooms that served as bedroom, kitchen, living area, and workshop combined. The buildings lacked adequate ventilation, proper sanitation, or sufficient natural light, creating conditions that bred both disease and desperation. Yet within these cramped quarters, immigrant families worked tirelessly to establish themselves in their adopted homeland. Records from PS 7, where young Alphonse attended elementary school, paint the picture of an intelligent but restless child whose potential was evident even in those early years. His teachers noted his quick wit and natural leadership abilities, observing how other children naturally gravitated toward him during playground activities and group projects. However, they also documented his tendency toward defiance, his impatience with authority, and his apparent belief that the rules that governed others somehow did not apply to him. At age 10, Alphonse was already displaying the charisma that would later command loyalty from hundreds of followers. He possessed an unusual ability to read people, understanding instinctively what motivated them and how to appeal to their desires and fears. This talent manifested itself in his ability to organize elaborate games among neighborhood children, negotiate disputes between different ethnic groups, and convince adults to trust him with responsibilities typically reserved for older children. However, the structured environment of formal education proved increasingly incompatible with his restless spirit and growing awareness of the more lucrative opportunities that existed beyond the classroom walls. The curriculum seemed irrelevant to a boy who could observe daily examples of men making substantial sums through activities that bore no resemblance to anything taught in school. While his teachers preached the virtues of hard work and delayed gratification, the streets offered lessons in immediate reward and practical power. The turning point in young Capone's educational journey came during his 6th grade year at PS 133, following his family's move to a slightly better neighborhood. A confrontation with his teacher, Miss O'Brien, escalated when 14-year-old Alphonse struck back after being disciplined for disrupting class. The incident resulted in his immediate expulsion, effectively ending his formal education at an age when most children were just beginning to discover their academic potential. This moment would prove pivotal in the development of the future crime boss, as it freed him from the conventional path that led to factory work or manual labor and thrust him toward the mentors who would shape his criminal education. His parents, devastated by their son's expulsion, attempted to enroll him in other schools, but Alphonse had already tasted the freedom that came with rejection of traditional authority, and he showed little interest in returning to the classroom. The streets of Brooklyn in the early 1900s served as Al Capone's true university, offering a curriculum in survival, strategy, and the complex social dynamics that governed urban life. The neighborhood was home to several established criminal organizations, many of them remnants of the Black Hand societies that had crossed the Atlantic with the wave of Italian immigration. These groups operated sophisticated protection rackets, controlled illegal gambling operations, and maintained territorial boundaries that were enforced through a combination of negotiation and intimidation. The Black Hand, or La Mano Nera, represented a particularly sinister aspect of Italian-American life during this period. Unlike the organized crime families that would later emerge, Black Hand groups were typically loose associations of criminals who specialized in extortion, kidnapping, and intimidation within their own immigrant communities. They preyed upon successful Italian-American businessmen, sending threatening letters adorned with Black handprints and demands for payment to ensure the safety of family members. For a teenager with limited legitimate prospects, these criminal organizations represented both danger and opportunity. Young men who demonstrated courage, intelligence, and loyalty could find themselves recruited into activities that offered far greater financial rewards than any legal employment available to immigrants. However, the price of admission to this world was steep, requiring absolute commitment and the acceptance of violence as a routine aspect of business operations. It was in this complex environment that young Capone first encountered Johnny Torrio, a man whose influence would prove instrumental in shaping the future crime boss's approach to criminal enterprise. Torrio, though only 16 years older than Capone, had already established himself as a rising figure in Brooklyn's criminal hierarchy. Born in Montepeloso, Italy, and brought to New York as a child, Torrio understood both the opportunities and limitations that defined immigrant life in America. Unlike the brutal and impulsive criminals who dominated many street gangs, Torrio possessed a businessman's mind and a strategist's patience. He had observed that the most successful criminal enterprises were those that operated with the same attention to organization and long-term planning that characterized legitimate businesses. Violence, in Torrio's philosophy, was a tool to be used strategically rather than an expression of emotion or personal preference. Torrio recognized in the young Capone a rare combination of intelligence, ambition, and the kind of fearless determination that could prove invaluable in their dangerous profession. More importantly, he saw potential for development, understanding that raw talent required proper guidance to reach its full potential. Under Torrio's mentorship, Capone would learn lessons that would serve him throughout his criminal career. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone began his apprenticeship in the criminal arts, starting with simple tasks that allowed him to observe and learn without taking significant risks. He learned the importance of organization, understanding that successful criminal enterprises required detailed record-keeping, careful financial management, and systematic approaches to problem-solving. Torrio taught him the value of strategic alliances, showing him how temporary partnerships could accomplish objectives that would be impossible for any single organization to achieve alone. Perhaps most importantly, Torrio instructed his young protege in the necessity of maintaining a delicate balance between cooperation and intimidation. Successful criminals, he explained, needed to be feared enough to command respect, but not so brutal as to attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or provoke unified opposition from their victims. This philosophy would later become a cornerstone of Capone's approach to business, allowing him to build an empire based on calculated violence rather than random brutality. The young man's criminal education continued in the Harvard Inn, a Brooklyn establishment that served as both a neighborhood saloon and an informal headquarters for local criminal activities. The inn, located on Coney Island, was owned by Frankie Yale, another influential figure in Capone's development. Working as a bartender and bouncer, positions that Torrio had arranged for him, Capone was able to observe the intricate social dynamics of the criminal underworld while earning a legitimate income that satisfied his parents' concerns about his employment. The Harvard Inn attracted a diverse clientele that provided Capone with an education in human nature that no formal institution could have offered. Dock workers seeking escape from their daily struggles rubbed shoulders with successful businessmen looking for entertainment unavailable in more respectable establishments. Politicians met with contractors to negotiate deals that would never appear in official records, while established criminals conducted business over glasses of whiskey and elaborate meals. In this environment, Capone learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when negotiations were proceeding smoothly and when they were about to turn violent. He observed how successful men carried themselves, noting the difference between genuine confidence and the bluster that often masked insecurity. Most importantly, he began to understand the complex web of relationships that connected legitimate business, politics, and criminal enterprise in ways that would have shocked the average citizen. It was also at the Harvard Inn that Alphonse Capone acquired the facial scars that would later earn him the nickname Scarface, though he would spend the rest of his life minimizing their significance and creating alternative explanations for their origin. The incident occurred during a typically busy evening when tensions between different groups of patrons had been building throughout the night. A young man named Frank Galluccio had brought his sister to the inn for dinner, and Capone, working as a bouncer, made what Galluccio considered an inappropriate comment about the woman's appearance. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Galluccio, armed with a knife and fueled by righteous anger, slashed Capone 3 times across the left side of his face before other patrons could intervene. The wounds were deep and would leave permanent scars that fundamentally altered Capone's appearance. The 3 parallel cuts ran from his ear to his mouth, creating a disfigurement that would make him instantly recognizable for the rest of his life. The incident taught Capone valuable lessons about the importance of respect, the consequences of carelessness, and the need for constant vigilance in his chosen profession. More importantly, it demonstrated that reputation in the criminal world was built not just on success but on how one handled failure and adversity. Rather than seeking revenge against Galluccio, Capone chose to treat the incident as a learning experience, eventually developing a grudging respect for the man who had marked him. Though he would later claim these scars resulted from combat service during World War I, creating a more heroic origin story for public consumption, the truth was far more mundane, but no less significant in shaping his reputation within criminal circles. The scars became a symbol of his authenticity in a world where reputation was everything, marking him as someone who had paid a price for his involvement in dangerous activities. Rather than attempting to hide the disfigurement through medical treatment or cosmetic measures, Capone learned to wear his scars as badges of his commitment to the criminal life. They served as conversation starters, allowing him to demonstrate his ability to laugh at his own misfortune while subtly reminding others that he was not someone to be trifled with. The scars became part of his persona, contributing to an image of dangerous charisma that would prove invaluable in his later career. As Capone matured into his late teens, his reputation within Brooklyn's criminal community continued to grow, built on a foundation of demonstrated competence and unwavering loyalty to his associates. He had proven himself capable of handling increasingly complex responsibilities, from collecting debts to mediating disputes between different criminal factions. His success in these endeavors caught the attention of Frankie Yale, the Harvard Inn's owner and one of Brooklyn's most powerful crime bosses. Yale recognized Capone's potential and began grooming him for greater responsibilities within his organization. Unlike Torrio, who had focused on teaching general principles of criminal enterprise, Yale provided education in specific skills that would prove invaluable in the years ahead. Under Yale's mentorship, Capone's education expanded to include the importation and distribution of illegal goods, the systematic corruption of public officials, and the management of legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for criminal activities. Yale's operations were extensive and sophisticated, requiring a level of organizational skill that went far beyond simple street crime. He controlled several neighborhoods in Brooklyn, maintained interests in legal businesses ranging from restaurants to construction companies, and had developed relationships with political figures that allowed his organization to operate with minimal interference from law enforcement. Managing this empire required administrators as much as enforcers, and Yale began training Capone to fill such a role. The relationship with Yale also provided Capone with his first exposure to the national network of criminal organizations that was beginning to emerge across the United States. Through Yale's connections, he learned about opportunities in other cities, particularly Chicago, where changing social conditions and legal restrictions were creating unprecedented opportunities for those willing to take the substantial risks involved in the illegal liquor trade. During this period of criminal education, Capone also experienced significant developments in his personal life. He met May Josephine Coughlin, an Irish-American woman whose family had achieved a level of respectability that the Capones still aspired to reach. May was a shop girl, working in a department store and living with her family in a neighborhood that represented a step up from the tenements where Capone had grown up. Their relationship began in 1918, during a period when Capone was establishing himself as a significant figure in Brooklyn's criminal community. Despite the dangerous nature of his profession, or perhaps because of the excitement it represented, May was drawn to the confident young man who seemed destined for success. Their courtship proceeded quickly, culminating in marriage on December 30th, 1918, just weeks after the birth of their son, Albert Francis Capone, known throughout his life as Sonny. The birth of his son marked a significant evolution in Capone's thinking about his criminal career and his place in the world. No longer was he simply a young man seeking excitement and easy money. He was now a father with responsibilities that extended far beyond his own survival and success. This new perspective would influence his decision-making for the rest of his life, driving him to build an organization that could provide long-term security and prosperity for his family. May's influence on Capone was profound and lasting, providing a stabilizing force that helped him maintain connections to conventional society, even as his criminal activities became increasingly notorious. She represented the respectable life that he was determined to provide for his family, serving as a reminder of the ultimate purpose behind his dangerous chosen profession. Their relationship would endure through decades of legal troubles, imprisonment, and public notoriety, demonstrating a personal loyalty that paralleled the professional loyalty that characterized his criminal organization. By 1919, Al Capone had completed his apprenticeship in the criminal arts, emerging as a sophisticated operator who understood both the opportunities and limitations of criminal enterprise in an urban environment. He had learned from some of Brooklyn's most successful criminals, survived the violent realities of street life, and demonstrated his ability to lead and organize complex operations involving multiple participants and substantial financial resources. However, the opportunities available to him in Brooklyn were limited by established hierarchies and territorial boundaries that had been in place for years. The criminal organizations that controlled the borough's illegal activities were mature enterprises with clearly defined leadership structures and limited room for advancement. For a young man with Capone's ambitions, Brooklyn represented security, but not the unlimited potential that drove his dreams of prosperity. When Johnny Torrio, his former mentor who had relocated to Chicago several years earlier, sent word about the unprecedented opportunities being created by Prohibition, Capone faced a choice that would determine the trajectory of his entire life. He could remain in Brooklyn, where his position was secure and his future predictable, or he could venture into unknown territory where the potential rewards were enormous, but the risks were equally substantial. The decision to leave Brooklyn was not made lightly or quickly. It meant abandoning the familiar streets where he had learned his trade, leaving behind the network of relationships that had sustained and protected him, and entering a city where he would need to prove himself all over again. More importantly, it meant uprooting his young family and taking them to a place where their safety and security would depend entirely on his ability to succeed in an unfamiliar environment. However, the promise of Chicago proved too tempting to ignore. Torrio's letters painted a picture of a city where traditional criminal organizations were struggling to adapt to the new opportunities created by the Volstead Act, leaving vast territories and enormous profits available to those bold enough to seize them. The established crime bosses of Chicago, Torrio reported, were old-fashioned in their thinking and methods, creating openings for younger, more innovative operators who understood the changing nature of American society. As 1919 drew to a close, Al Capone prepared to make the journey that would transform him from a Brooklyn street criminal into one of America's most notorious crime bosses. The lessons learned in his hometown had provided him with the skills and knowledge necessary for success, but the true test of his abilities lay ahead in the Windy City, where Prohibition was about to create opportunities beyond his wildest imagination. The young man who boarded the train to Chicago with his wife and infant son carried with him more than just personal ambitions and family responsibilities. He represented a new generation of criminals who understood that success in their chosen profession required the same intelligence, organization, and strategic thinking that drove legitimate businesses. The Brooklyn streets had taught him well, providing him with a foundation of experience and knowledge that would prove invaluable in the challenges ahead. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying the Capone family toward their uncertain but promising future, Alphonse Gabriel Capone was leaving behind not just a city, but an entire phase of his life. The education was complete, the apprenticeship finished. Chicago would provide the stage where these lessons would be put to their ultimate test, where the young man from Brooklyn would either fulfill his enormous potential or fall victim to the very forces he sought to control. When Al Capone's train pulled into Union Station in the winter of 1920, he stepped onto the platform of a city that was about to become the epicenter of America's greatest social experiment and its most spectacular failure. Chicago in 1920 was a metropolis in transition, a city where the old order was crumbling under the weight of rapid social change and a new constitutional amendment that would transform the very nature of American criminal enterprise. The 18th Amendment, which had taken effect on January 16, 1920, prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. What lawmakers had envisioned as a moral crusade to purify American society had instead created the largest business opportunity in criminal history. In Chicago, where corruption was already endemic and political machines operated with brazen efficiency, prohibition would not eliminate the liquor trade, but simply drive it underground, where it would flourish beyond anyone's imagination. Chicago had always been a city of extremes, where immense wealth coexisted with grinding poverty, where captains of industry built mansions within sight of immigrant slums. The city's rapid growth during the late 19th century had created a complex urban ecosystem where legitimate business and criminal enterprise often operated in partnership. Political corruption was not merely tolerated, but institutionalized, with elected officials openly maintaining relationships with gambling operators, brothel keepers, and other entrepreneurs whose businesses existed outside the boundaries of legal commerce. The arrival of Prohibition transformed this already complex landscape into something unprecedented in American history. Suddenly, millions of law-abiding citizens found themselves in need of products and services that could only be obtained through criminal channels. The demand for alcoholic beverages did not disappear with the passage of the Volstead Act. It simply created a black market that generated profits beyond the dreams of traditional criminals. Johnny Torrio, who had preceded Capone to Chicago by several years, understood the magnitude of this opportunity better than most of his contemporaries. While other criminal leaders focused on traditional activities like gambling, prostitution, and minor theft, Torrio recognized that the liquor trade could become the foundation of a criminal empire that would dwarf anything that had come before. His invitation to Capone was not merely an offer of employment, but a chance to participate in the creation of something entirely new. When Capone arrived in Chicago, he found his former mentor already well established as a major figure in the city's criminal hierarchy. Torrio had built his organization through a combination of strategic alliances, careful planning, and selective violence, creating a network that controlled substantial territory on the city's south side. However, the full potential of the Prohibition-era opportunities had not yet been realized, and Torrio needed associates who possessed both the intelligence to understand complex business operations and the courage to defend their interests against increasingly violent competition. The Chicago that welcomed Al Capone was a city divided into clearly defined territories, each controlled by different criminal organizations that had evolved from the ethnic gangs of earlier decades. The north side was dominated by Irish criminals led by Dion O'Banion, a florist whose legitimate business served as a front for extensive illegal operations. The west side fell under the influence of various Polish and Jewish groups, while the south side was contested by Italian organizations, including Torrio's expanding enterprise. These territorial divisions were not merely geographical, but represented complex webs of business relationships, political connections, and historical alliances that had developed over many years. Each group maintained its own sources of supply, distribution networks, and protection arrangements with corrupt officials. The delicate balance between these organizations had been maintained through a combination of mutual respect, strategic partnerships, and the implicit threat of violence against those who violated established boundaries. Torrio assigned Capone to manage operations in Cicero, a suburb of Chicago that offered unique advantages for their expanding liquor business. Cicero was technically outside Chicago's city limits, which meant it fell under different political and legal jurisdictions. More importantly, it was home to numerous manufacturing facilities and working-class neighborhoods, whose residents represented a substantial market for illegal alcoholic beverages. The location also provided easy access to transportation routes that could be used to move products from suppliers in other states. The task of establishing control over Cicero required Capone to demonstrate all the skills he had learned during his Brooklyn apprenticeship, but on a scale that far exceeded anything he had previously attempted. He needed to identify and neutralize competing operations, establish relationships with local political figures, create distribution networks that could serve thousands of customers, and build an organization capable of defending its territory against rivals who were becoming increasingly desperate as competition intensified. Capone approached these challenges with the systematic methodology that Torrio had taught him, treating each aspect of the operation as a business problem that required careful analysis and strategic thinking. He began by conducting a thorough assessment of existing criminal activities in Cicero, identifying which operations were profitable enough to warrant attention and which competitors posed the greatest threats to his plans for expansion. The establishment of speakeasies became a cornerstone of Capone's strategy for controlling the Cicero liquor trade. These illegal drinking establishments served multiple functions within his organization, providing not only retail outlets for alcoholic beverages, but also gathering places where other criminal activities could be organized and conducted. A well-managed speakeasy could serve as headquarters for gambling operations, a meeting place for business discussions, and a source of intelligence about competing organizations and law enforcement activities. Creating a network of speakeasies required substantial initial investment and ongoing operational support. Each establishment needed a reliable supply of alcoholic beverages, which meant developing relationships with importers, bootleggers, and local producers who could provide products of acceptable quality at competitive prices. The speakeasies also required protection from law enforcement raids, which necessitated the corruption of police officials, federal agents, and political figures who might otherwise interfere with operations. Capone's approach to law enforcement corruption demonstrated the sophistication that distinguished his organization from earlier criminal enterprises. Rather than simply bribing individual officers when problems arose, he developed systematic relationships with entire departments, creating networks of corrupted officials who provided advance warning of planned raids, protection during vulnerable operations, and assistance in neutralizing competitors who refused to cooperate with his organization's expansion plans. The financial resources required to maintain these corruption networks were enormous, but the profits generated by the liquor trade during Prohibition made such investments not only possible, but essential for survival. Studies of Capone's organization suggest that corruption payments represented a significant portion of operational expenses, but they also provided a level of protection that allowed his criminal enterprise to operate with unprecedented openness and efficiency. As Capone's influence in Cicero expanded, he began to attract the attention of Chicago's established criminal leaders, some of whom viewed his success as a threat to their own operations. The most significant challenge came from the O'Banion organization, which controlled extensive territory on Chicago's north side and had established relationships with many of the same suppliers and political figures that Capone was attempting to cultivate. Dion O'Banion was a complex figure whose legitimate business as a florist provided an ironic counterpoint to his criminal activities. His flower shop, located across the street from Holy Name Cathedral, served as headquarters for operations that included not only the liquor trade but also gambling, loan sharking, and various forms of extortion. O'Banion's organization was notable for its discipline and efficiency, qualities that had allowed it to survive and prosper during a period when many criminal groups were destroyed by internal conflicts or law enforcement pressure. The initial relationship between Capone and O'Banion was characterized by wary cooperation rather than open hostility. Both leaders understood that Chicago was large enough to accommodate multiple organizations, provided that territorial boundaries were respected and business conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than violence. However, as the profits available through the liquor trade continued to grow, the temptation to expand beyond established territories became increasingly difficult to resist. The first serious confrontation between Capone's organization and the O'Banion group arose over control of suppliers who were attempting to serve both organizations simultaneously. Several distilleries and import operations had developed relationships with multiple criminal groups, selling their products to whoever offered the best prices and most reliable payment. This arrangement worked reasonably well when demand was limited, but as the market expanded, suppliers found themselves caught between competing organizations that demanded exclusive relationships. Capone's response to this challenge demonstrated both his business acumen and his willingness to use intimidation when negotiation proved insufficient. Rather than attempting to outbid his competitors for supplier loyalty, he focused on creating integrated operations that reduced his organization's dependence on outside providers. This strategy included the establishment of illegal distilleries, the development of smuggling networks that could bring products directly from Canada and Mexico, and the creation of legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for distribution operations. The illegal distilleries that Capone's organization established represented a significant technological and logistical achievement requiring expertise in chemistry, engineering, and large-scale manufacturing that went far beyond the capabilities of traditional criminal groups. These facilities produced thousands of gallons of alcoholic beverages each week, utilizing equipment and techniques that rivaled those employed by legitimate manufacturers before Prohibition. Operating these distilleries required a workforce of skilled technicians, laborers, and security personnel who could maintain production schedules while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. The facilities needed to be located in areas where industrial activity would not attract suspicion, supplied with raw materials through channels that could not be traced to criminal organizations, and protected by security measures that could prevent sabotage by competitors or raids by federal agents. The profits generated by these integrated operations provided Capone with financial resources that exceeded those available to most of his competitors, allowing him to expand his organization at a pace that other criminal leaders found difficult to match. By 1922, his empire included dozens of speakeasies, several illegal distilleries, extensive smuggling networks, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for various criminal activities. This rapid expansion brought both opportunities and challenges. The increased revenue allowed Capone to hire additional personnel, expand into new territories, and invest in equipment and facilities that improved the efficiency of his operations. However, success also attracted attention from law enforcement agencies, competing criminal organizations, and federal officials who were beginning to recognize the magnitude of the challenge that Prohibition had created. The federal government's approach to prohibition enforcement was hampered by limited resources, jurisdictional conflicts, and the same corruption that plagued local law enforcement agencies. Federal agents were often outnumbered and outgunned by criminal organizations that could afford to purchase military-grade weapons and hire experienced personnel. More significantly, federal enforcement efforts were undermined by the fact that many citizens viewed prohibition as an unjust and unenforceable law that deserved to be violated. Capone's organization adapted to these enforcement challenges by developing sophisticated intelligence networks that provided advance warning of federal operations, creating mobile facilities that could be relocated quickly when threatened, and establishing relationships with corrupt federal officials who could provide protection from their own agencies. These defensive measures were expensive and complex, but they allowed his criminal enterprise to operate with a level of security that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The scope of Capone's operations during this period was truly remarkable, encompassing not only the production and distribution of alcoholic beverages, but also gambling establishments, houses of ill repute, and various forms of illegal lending. His organization employed hundreds of people in capacities ranging from armed security to accounting, creating a parallel economy that operated alongside Chicago's legitimate business community. The gambling operations represented a particularly sophisticated aspect of Capone's empire, utilizing technologies and organizational methods that were far advanced beyond anything previously seen in criminal enterprises. His establishments offered everything from traditional card games to elaborate betting operations that covered sporting events, political elections, and other activities that attracted public interest. These gambling houses were designed to appeal to customers from all social classes, from working-class immigrants seeking modest entertainment to wealthy businessmen looking for high-stakes excitement. The management of these diverse operations required administrative skills that rivaled those of legitimate corporations. Capone's organization maintained detailed financial records, employed professional accountants, and utilized modern communication systems to coordinate activities across multiple locations. The complexity of these operations demonstrates the evolution of American organized crime from simple street gangs to sophisticated business enterprises. Perhaps most remarkably, Capone's organization began to develop what could only be described as a corporate culture, with established hierarchies, standardized procedures, and systems for training new personnel. Loyalty was rewarded with advancement and financial compensation, while betrayal was met with swift and decisive punishment. This organizational approach created a level of discipline and efficiency that allowed Capone's empire to function smoothly, even as it expanded rapidly. The political dimension of Capone's operations was equally sophisticated, involving relationships with elected officials at every level of government. His organization maintained connections with city councilmen, county commissioners, state legislators, and even federal officials who could provide protection from law enforcement interference. These relationships were cultivated through a combination of financial incentives, personal favors, and strategic alliances that benefited both parties. The corruption of political figures was not simply a matter of offering bribes, but involved the creation of mutually beneficial partnerships that served the interests of both criminal organizations and legitimate political machines. Politicians provided protection and favorable treatment in exchange for financial support and assistance in maintaining control over their territories. This symbiotic relationship created a system of governance that operated parallel to official government structures. By 1923, Capone had emerged as one of Chicago's most powerful criminal leaders, controlling territory that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue and employed hundreds of people in various capacities. His organization had evolved from the simple territorial gang that Torrio had established into a sophisticated business enterprise that operated across multiple industries and jurisdictions. The transformation of Al Capone from a Brooklyn street criminal to a Chicago crime boss was complete, but the young man who had achieved this remarkable success was also beginning to pay the personal costs associated with such power. The constant threat of violence, the pressure of managing complex operations, and the need to maintain absolute control over his organization had hardened him into a figure who commanded both respect and fear throughout the American underworld. The relationship between Capone and Torrio had also evolved significantly during this period. While Torrio remained the nominal head of their partnership, it had become increasingly clear that Capone possessed the vision, determination, and organizational skills necessary to build something far larger than anything either man had originally envisioned. The student was gradually surpassing his mentor, setting the stage for changes that would soon reshape the entire landscape of Chicago's criminal underworld. As 1923 drew to a close, Al Capone stood at the threshold of even greater power and influence. His organization had proven its ability to adapt to changing circumstances, overcome formidable challenges, and generate enormous profits in an increasingly competitive environment. However, the very success that had elevated him to prominence was also attracting attention from rivals who viewed his growing empire as a threat to their own survival and prosperity. The stage was being set for conflicts that would test every lesson Capone had learned during his rise to power, confrontations that would determine whether his organization could maintain its dominance or fall victim to the violence that was becoming an increasingly common feature of Chicago's criminal landscape. The foundation had been built, the empire established, and the profits secured. What remained was the ultimate test of Capone's ability to hold on to what he had gained and continue expanding in a world where yesterday's allies could become tomorrow's enemies. The transformation of Al Capone from America's most notorious criminal into a federal prisoner began not with dramatic raids or shootouts, but with the meticulous examination of financial records by federal accountants who understood that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations left traces of their activities in the flow of money. The Internal Revenue Service, under the leadership of Special Agent Frank Wilson, had developed an innovative approach to combating organized crime that bypassed the traditional challenges of witness intimidation and local corruption. Wilson and his team of investigators recognized that Capone's lavish lifestyle and obvious wealth created a fundamental contradiction that could be exploited through careful financial analysis. While proving specific criminal acts remained difficult, due to the climate of fear and corruption that surrounded Capone's organization, demonstrating that his expenditures far exceeded any legitimate source of income, required only patience and accounting expertise. The federal investigation that would ultimately bring down Capone began in earnest in 1928, when IRS agents started systematically documenting his purchases, investments, and daily expenses. They tracked his gambling losses at racetracks, catalogued his expenditures on clothing and jewelry, and calculated the costs of maintaining his multiple residences and private security force. Every receipt, every bank transaction, and every documented purchase became evidence in a case that was built through months of painstaking detective work. The challenge facing federal investigators was enormous, as Capone had taken considerable precautions to conceal the sources of his income and minimize his official financial footprint. His organization operated primarily on a cash basis, avoiding bank accounts and official transactions whenever possible. Legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal activities were structured to show minimal profits, while the substantial revenues generated by illegal operations were laundered through complex networks of intermediaries and shell companies. However, Capone's very success created vulnerabilities that careful investigators could exploit. The scale of his operations required substantial infrastructure and ongoing expenses that could not be completely hidden from scrutiny. The corruption payments necessary to maintain protection, the salaries of hundreds of employees, and the costs of the luxurious lifestyle that served as a symbol of his power all created documentary evidence that federal agents could use to build their case. The breakthrough in the federal investigation came when agents discovered that several of Capone's associates had been making large cash deposits in banks throughout the Chicago area. While these individuals claimed that the money represented legitimate business income, the amounts involved were inconsistent with their declared occupations and known business activities. More importantly, the pattern of deposits suggested a systematic effort to convert criminal proceeds into seemingly legitimate assets. Elliot Ness and his team of federal agents, who would later be celebrated as the Untouchables, played a complementary role in the government's campaign against Capone by targeting the physical infrastructure of his organization. Their raids on illegal distilleries and smuggling operations served to disrupt his business activities while gathering evidence that could be used in both criminal and tax proceedings. However, the real foundation of the case against Capone was being built by the accountants and financial investigators who were systematically documenting his unreported income. The legal strategy developed by federal prosecutors was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to prove specific acts of violence or corruption, they would demonstrate that Capone had received substantial income from illegal sources and had failed to report this income on his federal tax returns. This approach avoided many of the traditional challenges associated with prosecuting organized crime figures, as it did not require the cooperation of witnesses who might be intimidated or corrupted. The grand jury investigation that preceded Capone's indictment revealed the full scope of his organization's financial operations. Federal agents had documented expenditures of over $1 million per year during the late 1920s, at a time when the average American family earned less than $2,000 annually. The contrast between Capone's lavish lifestyle and his reported income of $0 for tax purposes created a compelling case for criminal prosecution. Capone's initial response to the federal investigation was to attempt the same corruption strategies that had proven successful against local law enforcement. His organization made overtures to federal agents, politicians, and court officials, offering substantial financial incentives in exchange for favorable treatment. However, the federal agents assigned to his case had been specifically selected for their integrity and resistance to corruption, while the political environment had changed in ways that made protection increasingly difficult to obtain. The stock market crash of 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression created economic pressures that fundamentally altered the political landscape in which Capone had operated. Politicians who had previously been willing to accept corruption payments in exchange for protection now found themselves under intense scrutiny from constituents who were demanding accountability and reform. The economic crisis made the lavish expenditures associated with criminal enterprises seem particularly offensive to a public that was experiencing widespread hardship. President Herbert Hoover, facing intense pressure to demonstrate federal leadership during the economic crisis, identified the prosecution of Al Capone as a symbol of the government's commitment to law and order. The president personally directed federal agencies to to make Capone's capture and prosecution a priority, ensuring that the case would receive the resources and attention necessary for success. This high-level political support provided federal investigators with protection from local interference and access to specialized expertise from throughout the government. The indictment of Al Capone on federal tax evasion charges was announced in June 1931, marking the beginning of the most closely watched criminal trial of the era. The charges included 22 counts of tax evasion covering the years 1925 through 1929, with the government alleging that Capone had failed to report income of more than $1 million during this period. The potential penalties included substantial fines and up to 30 years in federal prison. Capone's legal team, led by some of the most expensive attorneys in the country, initially attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would limit his prison sentence in exchange for guilty pleas on selected charges. These negotiations appeared to be progressing toward a resolution when federal judge James Herbert Wilkerson intervened, declaring that he would not be bound by any agreement between prosecutors and defense attorneys. The judge's position meant that Capone would face the full penalties associated with his crimes if convicted. The trial itself became a national spectacle, with newspaper reporters from throughout the country covering every development in proceedings that seemed to symbolize the broader struggle between law and order and the criminal forces that had flourished during Prohibition. The prosecution's case was built around financial evidence that documented Capone's expenditures and demonstrated the impossibility of funding such a lifestyle through legitimate means. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit the government's financial analysis and suggest alternative explanations for Capone's apparent wealth. They argued that much of his income represented winnings from gambling activities, which were technically legal in some jurisdictions, and that his lavish spending was funded by loans and gifts from associates rather than direct criminal proceeds. However, these arguments were undermined by the systematic nature of the government's evidence and the obvious implausibility of the alternative explanations. The jury's verdict, delivered in October 1931, found Capone guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion and failure to file tax returns. Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, substantial fines, and the payment of back taxes and penalties that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. The sentence represented one of the harshest penalties ever imposed for tax evasion and sent a clear message that federal authorities were committed to pursuing organized crime leaders regardless of their wealth or political connections. Capone's initial incarceration was served at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he attempted to use his wealth and influence to secure preferential treatment from prison officials and fellow inmates. Reports from federal investigators suggest that he was able to maintain a relatively comfortable lifestyle within the prison, with access to special foods, private communications, and other privileges that were not available to ordinary prisoners. However, federal authorities became concerned that Capone was continuing to direct his criminal organization from prison, and that the corruption that had characterized his operations in Chicago was beginning to affect the federal prison system. In 1934, he was transferred to the newly opened United States Penitentiary at Alcatraz, a maximum security facility located on an island in San Francisco Bay that had been specifically designed to house the most dangerous and influential criminals in the federal system. Alcatraz represented a revolutionary approach to federal incarceration, with security measures and operational procedures that made communication with the outside world virtually impossible. The prison's isolated location, sophisticated monitoring systems, and specially trained staff were designed to prevent the type of corruption and outside influence that had compromised other federal facilities. For Capone, the transfer to Alcatraz meant the complete severing of his connections to the criminal empire he had built. The conditions at Alcatraz were deliberately harsh, designed to demonstrate that even the most powerful criminals would be treated as ordinary prisoners once they entered the federal system. Capone found himself subject to the same rules and regulations as every other inmate, with no special privileges or accommodations based on his wealth or former status. The psychological impact of this dramatic change in circumstances was profound, as he struggled to adapt to an environment where his reputation and resources provided no advantages. During his incarceration at Alcatraz, Capone's health began to deteriorate significantly due to the progression of neurosyphilis, a condition that had gone untreated for many years. The disease, which had been contracted during his youth in Brooklyn, began to affect his mental faculties and physical coordination in ways that became increasingly obvious to prison officials and fellow inmates. Medical records from this period document a gradual decline in cognitive function that would continue for the remainder of his life. The progression of Capone's illness coincided with fundamental changes changes in the criminal landscape that had made his empire possible. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 eliminated the primary source of revenue for organized crime groups, forcing them to adapt to new economic realities or face dissolution. Many of the criminal organizations that had flourished during the 1920s either disbanded or evolved into different types of enterprises that bore little resemblance to the territorial gangs of the Prohibition era. Capone's organization, deprived of its leaders' guidance and facing intense pressure from federal law enforcement, gradually fragmented into smaller groups that lacked the resources and coordination necessary to maintain control over Chicago's criminal activities. Former associates either retired from criminal activities, accepted subordinate positions within other organizations, or attempted to establish independent operations that never achieved the scale or influence of Capone's empire. The transformation of Chicago's criminal landscape during the 1930s demonstrated the extent to which Capone's personal leadership had been essential to his organization's success. Without his strategic vision, political connections, and ability to coordinate complex operations, the empire he had built proved unable to adapt to changing circumstances or maintain the territorial control that had been the foundation of its power. Meanwhile, federal law enforcement agencies used the success of the Capone prosecution as a model for pursuing other organized crime leaders throughout the United States. The techniques developed during the investigation, particularly the use of financial analysis to prove criminal activity, became standard tools in the federal government's campaign against organized crime. The precedent established by Capone's conviction demonstrated that no criminal organization was too powerful or well-connected to escape federal prosecution. Capone was released from federal prison in November 1939 after serving more than 7 years of his sentence. However, the man who emerged from Alcatraz bore little resemblance to the powerful crime boss who had dominated Chicago during the 1920s. The progression of neurosyphilis had significantly impaired his mental faculties, leaving him unable to resume the complex strategic thinking that had characterized his criminal career. His post-prison years were spent in relative obscurity at his estate in Palm Island, Florida, where he lived under the care of his family and medical professionals. The media occasionally reported on his activities, but the public interest that had once made him a national celebrity had largely dissipated. The criminal empire that had once generated headlines and influenced political elections had been reduced to memories and historical footnotes. The final years of Capone's life were marked by further deterioration in his health and mental condition. He suffered several strokes and experienced periods of confusion and disorientation that made normal social interaction increasingly difficult. Family members and associates from his criminal career noted the tragic contrast between the sharp, decisive leader they had known and the diminished figure he had become. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947, at his Florida estate, surrounded by family members who had remained loyal despite the notoriety and legal troubles that had characterized his life. The cause of death was officially listed as cardiac arrest, though the underlying condition of neurosyphilis had been the primary factor in his declining health for many years. He was 48 years old at the time of his death, having outlived many of his criminal associates and rivals who had perished during the violent conflicts of the Prohibition era. The funeral services for Capone were conducted quietly, with family members attempting to avoid the media attention that had followed him throughout his adult life. He was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Chicago, in a plot that would later become a destination for tourists and crime enthusiasts interested in visiting the grave of America's most notorious gangster. The legacy of Al Capone extends far beyond his criminal activities, encompassing his impact on American law enforcement, popular culture, and public understanding of organized crime. His prosecution demonstrated the effectiveness of financial investigation techniques that became standard tools in federal law enforcement, while his life story became a template for countless books, movies, and television programs that explored themes of crime, power, and corruption. The techniques developed during the Capone investigation influenced federal law enforcement strategies for decades, providing a model for pursuing sophisticated criminal organizations that operate across state boundaries. The success of the case helped establish the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a premier law enforcement agency and demonstrated the federal government's ability to combat organized crime when provided with adequate resources and political support. Capone's impact on popular culture has been equally significant, as his life story has been retold and reinterpreted countless times in various media formats. The image of the successful criminal who builds an empire through violence and corruption has become a recurring theme in American entertainment, with Capone serving as the archetypal figure whose influence can be seen in everything from classic Hollywood films to modern television series. However, the romanticization of Capone's criminal career in popular culture has often obscured the human costs associated with his activities. The violence that characterized his rise to power claimed dozens of lives and created an atmosphere of fear that affected thousands of Chicago residents. The corruption that enabled his empire undermined democratic institutions and demonstrated the vulnerability of local governments to criminal influence. The historical significance of Al Capone's career lies not just in his individual achievements, but in what his story reveals about American society during the Prohibition era. His success reflected the contradictions inherent in attempting to legislate morality through constitutional amendment, while his eventual downfall demonstrated the resilience of American legal institutions when confronted with unprecedented challenges. The transformation of a young Brooklyn street criminal into America's most notorious crime boss illustrates the opportunities and dangers created by rapid social change and ineffective governance. Capone's empire flourished in an environment where legal restrictions created enormous black market opportunities, while corruption and violence undermined the rule of law. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies and the importance of maintaining effective law enforcement institutions. Today, more than 75 years after his death, Al Capone remains one of the most recognizable figures in American criminal history. His name has become synonymous with organized crime, while his life story continues to fascinate new generations of Americans who struggle to understand how such a powerful criminal empire could have emerged in a democratic society. The lessons learned from Capone's rise and fall continue to influence contemporary discussions about crime, law enforcement, and social policy. His career demonstrates both the dangers posed by sophisticated criminal organizations and the effectiveness of persistent, well-resourced law enforcement efforts. The techniques developed to investigate and prosecute his organization remain relevant to modern efforts to combat organized crime, money laundering, and other complex criminal enterprises. The enduring fascination with Al Capone's life reflects broader American ambivalence about success, power, and the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate achievement. His story resonates because it combines elements that are both attractive and repulsive. The self-made immigrant who achieves wealth and influence through intelligence and determination, and the violent criminal who builds his empire on intimidation and brutality. As we conclude this examination of Al Capone's extraordinary life, we are reminded that history's most compelling figures are often those who embody the contradictions and conflicts of their times. Capone's story is ultimately the story of an era when America struggled to define itself in the face of rapid social change, technological advancement, and the clash between traditional values and modern realities. The scar-faced man from Brooklyn who dominated Chicago during the Roaring Twenties remains a powerful symbol of both American opportunity and American excess. His legacy serves as a reminder that in a society where individual achievement is highly valued, the line between legitimate success and criminal enterprise can sometimes become dangerously blurred. For those who have followed this journey through the life of Al Capone, we hope this exploration has provided insights into one of history's most fascinating and complex criminal figures. The story of Scarface Al continues to captivate audiences around the world, reminding us that the past has lessons to teach about power, corruption, and the eternal struggle between law and order. If you found this deep dive into criminal history compelling, we invite you to subscribe to Sleep Crime, where we continue to explore the most intriguing criminal cases and historical mysteries that have shaped our world. Join us as we uncover the stories behind the headlines and examine the human dramas that lie at the heart of history's most notorious crimes.